My name is Dan Zales. I am the leader of the League of Women Voters U.S. Forest and Wildfires team. And, we are a team, we're always open to new members. We meet once a month, although we tend to change the date depending on availability of the members. We're broadly dedicated to two basic principles. We really like forests and we really don't like destructive wildfires and the ones that are out of control and just threaten people and the property and their health. Beyond that, we have lots of really good discussions and share information about how to meet both of those goals. It's tricky and can be controversial, and we come from different perspectives, and we would love for you to also participate if you're interested in that topic. You can go to we're one of the climate interest group committees, and you can just, when you go to the climate interest group website, you can express your interest in this topic, and then then I'll get a hold of I'll be told who you are, and then I'll invite you to a meeting. Enough said about that. I'd like to introduce now our speaker, Maria Benech. Maria is a retired U.S. Forest Service resource manager. She did this for 36 years in the U.S. Forest Service. Maria's been with our team for about a little under a year, but she's made some great contributions, provided her professional perspectives working with the U.S. Forest Service. And she's going to talk about something that we've really emphasized in our team, which is building critical thinking skills for folks like you in local leagues, local communities, for the effort you put into it. Okay, Maria, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could join us. So I just wanted to say a couple more things. My experience, I will not say that I'm a NEPA expert, but I will say that I have a lot of actual experience doing NEPA. So over my career, I've done well over 50 NEPA documents, some very large-scale EISs, environmental impact statements. I've done many environmental assessments and dozens probably of category exclusion projects. So I have a lot of experience, but I am not an expert. And I will also say that the reason Dan and I have been talking quite a bit, and the reason this came about is just because we understand we all get information from various other groups that we belong to. And it's sometimes, it's summarized information, and sometimes it may not be exactly what's being done. And so what we really wanted to do is help people go back to the source information for these projects that are being presented to people, so that they could actually find the information themselves. So that's kind of how this came about. And it's a little complicated. If you're not in it, it's kind of a different language and some different things. And the other thing I'll say is I'll apologize right off the bat for my slides. I did a PowerPoint exactly the way you're told not to. There's a ton of words on all these slides. But the good news is I'm not going to read the slides. So like Dan said, they'll be for reference for you. So you don't have to read them. You can read them instead of listen to me talking, but it'd be good to listen and try to read, or read later if you can. So I wanted to start off with talking about the U.S. Forest Service mission, because I think sometimes people get a little confused. We are a multiple use agency. And so this is our mission, and it's not a preservation mission. So it's very different than, say, the Park Service or some other agencies. We are under the Department of Agriculture versus the Department of Interior. So lots of different activities that we do propose and people want us to do. Next slide. So the National Environment Policy Act, this kind of gives you some information on that, different when the law was enacted and different policies and requirements. But like I say, for me, what I want to emphasize here, in addition to the information on the slide, is that it requires a systematic interdisciplinary approach to planning. And I'll talk about interdisciplinary, explain what that means, and decision making. And then you have to consider the environmental impacts of the proposal that you're putting out there, and identify the adverse environmental effects that cannot be avoided, and should the proposal be implemented. Also have to consider the relationship between the local short-term and uses of the human environment and maintenance and enhancement of the long-term productivity, and have to identify any irreversible and irretrievable commitments of resources that would be involved in the proposed action, should it be implemented. So those are all requirements of this law that should be done in any, when you're analyzing any sort of proposal. And really, I like to talk about NEPA as a disclosure document. So it basically is letting you know, hey, proposing to do this activity, and these are potential impacts that are going to happen if we do that activity. Next slide. So all federal agencies are required to do these things under NEPA. So this goes for all agencies, not just the Forest Service. And what I want to talk about here too is, so the interdisciplinary approach is, we often call it an ID team, and the Forest Service uses that for pretty much all projects that we do, and it's a critical part. And so that team will have everything from, wildlife biologists and soil scientists and hydrologists and range specialists, and basically all different resources, all different specialists. They come together and work together as a team to look at the proposed action, create the proposed action, and then analyze the potential impacts of the proposed action and no action on the landscape. Next slide. So U.S. Forest Service objectives to meet NEPA are, these all come from our planning handbook. So anything you want to know about NEPA, you can go to Forest Service Handbook 1909.15, and it's all in there. And also you can go to the manual, which is 1900 Planning, Chapter 1950, Environmental Policy and Procedures. So all the information is in there, and it's the laws and sections of where these, where the policies can be found. And the CFRs that talk about on this slide, that's the Code of Federal Regulations. It's basically all where the publications of any federal agency creates documents. That's what CFR means. So for that. And then under NEPA, under the National Environmental Policy Act, so the agency conducts analysis to assess the nature and importance of the physical, biological, social, and economic effects of a proposed action and its reasonable alternatives. So, we always go out with a proposed action, but if there's other ways to meet the objectives that can actually, do the project in another way, those also have to be looked at. And the conclusions are reached about the significance of the effects on the human environment, and the conclusions about the significance of effects determine the levels of analysis and documentation that needs to be done. And that's what we're going to talk about, whether we are going to do a categorical exclusion, which is a decision memo, we're going to do an EA, environmental assessment, or whether we have to do an environmental impact statement. So those are the three different levels that potentially could be done under NEPA to do this analysis correctly. Next slide. So this is called the NEPA triangle. And it's, this is basically the Forest Service created this to, have a visual of what's happening. I added the blue arrows because Dan had a great suggestion of, hey, where does the public, where can the public be involved or get involved with these projects, and how does that happen? And I would say historically, if you see the top of this where it says proposed action, that's where the public was most, became involved. Forest Service put out a proposal, public came back and could comment on that proposal. Today, I'd say in the last 10 years, probably even a little more now, we have what's called collaborative groups, which I'll talk about a little later, but groups of individuals, local individuals representing all different sides to all issues. They come together and are really working really closely with the forests to determine what are we doing on that landscape? Where do we want to go? What sort of projects are being done? So collaborative groups are really playing a big role in the Forest Service for sure today. And it's not just in California, it's across the United States. So, and I really think that's an area that the league can look into getting involved in. So I think that's important. So the NEPA process starts on that left-hand side where it says proposal development. That's where it starts. And, you can read all the pieces and parts in there, but that's where we develop basically a project that's going to happen out on the ground. And then we go out with a proposed action. And on that right side where it says environmental analysis, scoping is where we send information out to our publics, anyone who potentially be impacted, adjacent landowners, that sort of thing. We develop alternatives, effects, and then findings. And a decision is made at the bottom of that right-hand side. That's by the decision maker, and then implementation. And you can see the different parts of implementation. Today, I think it's wonderful. We have a lot of citizen science and a lot of partners who are helping us do monitoring and evaluation, which I think is really important for the Forest Service, because I would say historically that was an area that we didn't spend a lot of time on, mainly because of funding. And it's really helpful to have folks out there, gathering data and information for us so we can, take a look and make sure what we're doing is what we want to be doing out there. Next slide. So again, we talked about how can we participate, citizens participate in this process. So every forest has what's called a SOPA, or Scheduled Proposed Action. And it's basically a list of every project that's being looked at on that forest and where it's at in its analysis process. Has it gone out for scoping? Is the project just being developed? Has the environmental document come out in its comment period, or has the decision been made? And so it's a great way to keep on top of what's actually happening on the forest. It's very easy. You just let the forest know, hey, you want to be on that list, and they'll put you on the list, and it comes out. Ours came out monthly, some might come out quarterly, but you'll get that just sent to you automatically. I talked a little bit about collaborative groups. And like I said, for the collaborative groups, they really cover a broad base of interests. So they are going to have somebody from, if there's a local timber industry or local group that's interested in, producing timber, and they're going to have Sierra Club representation and Autobahn. They're going to have off-highway vehicle groups, bicyclists, bicycling groups. They're going to have hikers. I mean, it really runs the gamut. It's a very broad-based group that is meeting with the forest and participating, again, in project proposals and project development, and helping the forest determine where do we want to go, and what do we want to do, and how do we want to do it. And I really think this is an area where local leagues could get involved. If you have interest or expertise, join. Hopefully we could join as a full member and a voting member and participate, or if nothing else, as an observational member, and really learn what's going on and kind of see how the process works. But I think it's a real opportunity for the league to get involved if we're interested in forest management and wildfires and prevention and all that. So I think it's an opportunity. There's forest mailing lists, field trips, all the rest of those things. So I think that's, if you want to get involved, if you want to participate, there's definitely lots of opportunities to do that. Next slide. So these are the different categories in NEPA, and I mentioned them a little bit earlier. The different levels of NEPA, so environmental impact statement, EISs, EAs, and categorical exclusions. I'm not going to talk much about categorical exclusions after this slide, because those are ones that basically they tend to be projects that are fairly simple and not very impactful, and they have to fall within these categories that were established by either the Secretary of Agriculture or the Chief of the Forest Service. And they're very limited in the scope and what they can do. And not much public participation. People know they're happening, but there's not like a objection process or any of that. There's basically like, here's the decision, it's going to happen. Of course, any project can always be litigated, and that can stop a project, but it's not, these tend to be categories that have been determined over long term, that aren't impactive. So that's what a categorical exclusion is. They're documented in something called a decision memo. So they're fairly simple projects, arguable for some people, I'm sure, but that's really what it is. And you can see in there, the key for these is there's no extraordinary circumstances that are a part of this. So that's a real key to this. Not having any of those things. And there's 7 categories of extraordinary circumstances that exist. And a couple of them, like, threatened and endangered species, that, those are there, may not be able to use category exclusion. Same with inventoried roadless areas or potential wilderness areas. If you're trying to do a project within those areas, may not be able to be done under a category exclusion. But I think the key for this too is talks about the mere presence of one or more of these 7 conditions does not preclude the use of a category exclusion, but the existence of a cause and effect relationship. So if something that you're doing out there is going to have an impact, then yeah, you cannot use category exclusion. So there's pretty tight on that. Again, those are limited in scope and limited number. Not a lot of projects fall within that category. Next slide. So in red, we highlighted, again, where public involvement can occur. So we wanted to emphasize, again, what the opportunities are for folks to be involved. So for the discussions and priority setting, again, collaborative groups are playing a much bigger role in that today. So I think that's important. Other things that are going to be involved with that is, the Forest Service, the chief in Washington sets our priorities, and he or she will come out with a list every year and say, hey, these are my top 5, 6, 7 priorities. And of course, our funding tends to follow what the top priorities of the chief is. And so that's going to dictate a lot of what we do. We're often given targets. Historically, there was a lot of timber targets that were given. Those aren't as big a deal today as they were historically. Certainly, we've moved away from that and moved more into, I would say, fields reduction acres in California. We're really focused on that. So targets for, that sort of work where we're going to protect communities in particular from wildfires is a big deal. And then we have, commitments through grants that we've, worked with partners on. So we have to, move forward and actually achieve that work with the money that we're being given. And partnerships with a lot of local groups and, larger national groups that we're working with to get work done. The PIL is given by the deciding official, and that's basically just kicks a project off. So, project is starting, and she is going to say, these are the people that I want on the team, the interdisciplinary team. You can see in that list, those are the various resources that are people that are going to be on this team. So it can be it's a very broad team. That's going to vary by project. Some projects are simple. They may only have, they might not have an economist or a landscape architect, but you're always going to have a wildlife biologist, aquatic biologist, soil scientists. Those are key core members that are always going to be looking at projects that we're doing in the field, and they're going to function as a team to look at these projects and analyze these projects and their impacts. They're going to get, the decision maker is going to say, hey, you need to do this, 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 and this. This is my expectation. These are your time frames. Go forth and do good work. And the ID team will meet, multiple times throughout the process, likely go out in the field together, be talking, the decision makers usually in the room for all the meetings, the field trips. So that way they're informed all through the process and have a good idea, because they have to make this decision long term. And so it's really nice when they can stay engaged with your process as it moves forward. And then again, developing a proposed action we talked about is project. What are you going to do? And that comes up with details, not just what you're going to do, but it includes what we call management requirements. And those are really specific things that those various resource folks will come up with and say, hey, if you're going to do this, I want to make sure that you're going to leave 5 snags per acre of the biggest trees out there. I want to make sure you're leaving a number of down logs per acre out there. And these requirements, these management requirements are part of the proposal. So you don't make a decision on, hey, you're going to do this, and we're not going to do those. Those are part of the proposal. You can't implement that project without making sure that those things are included as part of the work that you're going to be doing. So I think that's a really important part. And then I think they make the proposals tight, and we ensure that we're not having the impacts out there, which is why we use them. For scoping, again, it's a letter that's going to go out to the public. They're going to, it's going to include the purpose and need. So why are you doing this project? You got this proposal. Why are you doing it? And it should really explain clearly why that's being done. It's a very specific proposal of, exactly what's being done. And then comments, the comments that come back, if you're doing, if you're going to comment on a project, they really need to be specific and based on the latest science information. You can send in your opinion, but that's not probably going to help to move the process forward. So we really do want comments. We want information. I like to think that we are, experts in the field. The folks that are on the side team are experts, but we aren't the only experts. And we certainly don't know everything that's happening out on the ground. So we welcome new information or additional information, again, to make our project the best it can be. Alternative development, that's going to be based on public input. If there's some information we didn't know about, significant issues are generated, we're going to develop some more alternatives. The analysis, site specific, is really important. I can't emphasize that enough. Everything we do is, site specific, this piece of ground, where this is occurring, that's what we're looking at. Extensive surveys, information reviewed, latest science, latest research, often talking to the latest, to researchers who are working in the field. Because again, we're looking at, if we do this, what's the potential impact to the various resources on the ground? The decision, the draft, EA and public comment again. So we do all our analysis, send that out to the public again, and say, hey, this is what we see out there. This is what we think. This is what we have. And then there's an opportunity to comment again. The decision that's made is based on the analysis. And, honestly, sometimes it's based on politics, right? I always tell my boss, I was never someone who was a decision maker. And I said, I always have the luxury of being hardcore about resources and the potential impacts to the resources that she had to balance. Yeah, but there's things going on here, and there's congressmen over there, and there's this and that happening. So that's what she had to do when she was making a decision. But again, the analysis is the analysis. She doesn't change that and can't change that. So if she's going to make a decision that goes against the analysis, she's going to have some issues. And I don't recall ever really seeing that being done. But I'm sure it has been done. And that's why we lose in court sometimes, because, if you don't follow your analysis, says you're having impacts, and you make a decision that goes against that, you're not going to do very well in court. And the objection process is a new process. You might have heard historically it's called the appeals process. And the objection process now kind of comes before the final decision is made. And it's goes to the way the Forest Service works. So if a district ranger makes a decision, then the objection process goes to the forest supervisor. If the forest supervisor has made a decision, it'll go to the regional forester. So it goes to that next level of decision making. And then that reviewing officer will basically be contacting the objector, often have meetings with the objector to try to resolve these issues, and we can move forward, hopefully, with the final decision that goes out. And sometimes it just doesn't work and litigation happens, and that's definitely another option in the process. Next slide. So I just wanted to do a very simple, wanted to show a simple example. So this is an EA that was done years ago. It's for a campground. I think the whole EA was like 10 pages. So it's a very simple EA, but again, the analysis was a full analysis, but it covers about 32 acres. So there isn't a lot of area to cover. So it was fairly easy, I guess I'll say, for the ID team to go over this. But the process or the sections of the EA are consistent throughout any document. So it kind of gives you an example of that. Next slide. Again, this is this table of contents. Introductions, chapter 1, alternatives, chapter 2, and environmental consequences are chapter 3. So it's, that's the structure and the format. And again, all these are going to look pretty much just like this. So again, for you, for folks who are trying to look at, what are they doing and why are they doing it? This is kind of the structure you can follow, so you kind of know where to find the information that you're looking for. So next slide. So the introduction in this EA, again, it's chapter 1. And, the background is just how did the project come about? And this project actually came about, specifically, I just wanted to use an example because of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC relicensing was happening. And during that process, there's a ton of use in this area that this group is using. And dispersed camping was kind of out of control. So it's like, well, we need to build a new campground to accommodate the use, also for public safety and some other things. So that's what happened there. And, the background is going to cover all that information. It's also going to talk specifically about the location of the project. Where exactly is this happening? Where, and have maps and locations. So it's very clear where this is being done, how many acres are impacted, and all that information. Purpose and need is always why here and why now is what I like to say. So this purpose and need for this project talks about, this is a very popular area, lots of camping, lots of interest in camping, and there's a shortage of camping opportunities here because of the steep slopes and the steep canyon where this dam exists, where this reservoir exists. And so, this is going to be put mid-slope in an area that can basically be utilized and as a campground for folks who are going to use that area. So that's your purpose and or your purpose and need. Your proposed action, again, it's always going to be your alternative one. And so it's going to specifically, again, talk about those acres. So this one talks about, hey, it's going to be built in 3 phases. The first phase is 20 campgrounds. It has, 2 group campsites, two restrooms, et cetera, et cetera. So there's very specific information. And so, the public and the site official and the team, they all know exactly what they're looking at, what we're analyzing for when they're out there making, doing their analysis and looking at potential impacts to their resource. Decision framework, that's basically what's the decision being made and who's making it. And then public involvement, again, it's going to start with that scoping and issues, significant, non-significant issues that are identified come in. Next slide. So chapter 2 is alternatives. Alternative 1, like I say, always propose action. Alternative 2 is no action. We always analyze for no action because there is consequences often for most things of not doing anything. And so that always has an analysis associated with that too. It's not, typically it's not probably as detailed as the other analysis because, we're proposing an action often has more impacts, but again, it should always be analyzed. And additional alternatives, they're going to be generated from any significant issues that are generated from the public. And I just wanted to define what a significant issue is because I think that can be pretty confusing for folks. The significant issue is defined as those directly or indirectly caused by implementing the proposed action. So it's very, important that they're going to be caused. If you do this, this is going to happen. And oftentimes we get a lot of what are called non-significant issues from folks. And it's things that are outside the scope of the project. For this instance, this is a campground and someone might say, hey, I want you to build a boat ramp too. Well, that's outside the scope of what we're doing for this project. I'm not saying it's not needed, but it's not a part of this project. So it's outside the scope. A lot of times things are already decided by law or regulation, forest plan, or other higher level decisions. So it's already a done deal. We can't change that. It is what it is. So it's non-significant. It's irrelevant to the decision to be made. It's, like, hey, do a timber sale when you're doing that, campground. Yeah, no, it doesn't quite work. Doesn't fit. Or it could be conjectural or not supported by scientific or factual evidence. And sometimes that happens. People send stuff in, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I talked a little bit earlier about the project design elements or mitigation measures. Again, critical piece as part of the alternatives. They're not extras. They're not maybes. They are, we're gonna do these activities, and these things must be done in order to ensure we don't have impacts and to make the project basically whole. So they will be done with the project. They are part of it. Next slide. So chapter 3, environmental consequences. And so every one of those resource folks on the interdisciplinary team, they're going to produce a report. We're going to pull out information for, from the different resources to put in the project. Wildlife and aquatic biologists and botanists, they do biological evaluations. You can see other people in there. If there's not a specific report, each one has a report, fairly, very involved and very, again, site specific for this project that we're looking at. And they will do it for the proposed action as well as the no action alternative. For this EA, which was very simple, like I said, it didn't have a lot of information in here besides just the FONSI, because they finding no significant impact because of just the simplicity of the project. But it's the reports are part of the project public record and they're in there. So if you want that detail, you can always request these reports specifically to find out the information. You say, hey, I want to get the soil scientist report, and they'll send it to you so that you can really see what we're, can I, follow that logic and the information that they used to include in the EA. For environmental consequences, they include direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. So a direct effect is something like, if you're cutting down trees, that's a direct impact, right? For, potentially if it was a nesting tree or something like that, that's a direct effect in removal of habitat. The other thing is indirect. So it's later in time or at some distance from the actual activity. But again, it's an indirect impact of what you're proposing to do. And cumulative effects, basically, it looks at any other projects of the project you're doing combined with other projects that are past, present, and foreseeable into the future that are near the area. And we talked about historically, one of the concerns was, people were like, oh, well, I'll just do like 100 acres or 1,000-acre projects, or even whatever category I can fit it in a category of exclusions. I'll just do a bunch of those. And then I don't have to do an EA or an EIS. And that's something we, never do and don't do, because we've talked about that a lot in the agencies. Like, you can't split out projects so you can do a simpler analysis. It's just not done. And so cumulative effects looks at, again, your project, but any other adjacent projects or projects that potentially could be impacting the area that you're working in. Next slide. So the FONSI is finding no significant impact. This is a standard. These are the standard significant factors, the 10 significant factors, and you will see these in every FONSI, and they all have to be looked at and all have to be talked about. So that's just the standard format of that document. So for beneficial and adverse impacts, for the Forest Service, we tend to talk about things like sensitive species, wildlife and plant species in there. Threatened and endangered species are covered down below in number 9. So we don't talk about those in number 1, but we really do talk about sensitive and species. And sensitive species for the Forest Service are species that are determined by each forest. I'll say above and beyond threatened and endangered species that, of course, are designated by Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are species that the Forest Service determined, hey, we think these are some species that are also rare, or, may have, with the activities that we might propose, they might be impacted. We don't want them to become threatened and endangered, and so we establish these lists. They often are very much very similar to state lists. So if you've seen the state, many states have their own lists of, species that are of concern or species that are endangered. So that's what our lists tend to follow or mimic a lot of that. So for the potential, I'll just read from that EA, beneficial and adverse impacts. Talked about the biological evaluation for sensitive plants. It's completed. Surveys for sensitive plants no sensitive plants were found on the project site, and the B concludes the action alternatives has a no effect determination. And so they come up, the B's always have determinations of potential impacts. And in this project, there was no effect determinations because of the location, ability to avoid anything that was sensitive or endangered or any of that issues. So the same like for unique characteristics of the geographic area, tends to be fairly similar language for a lot of them. It's talking about things that are proximal to critical areas like parklands, such as Yosemite National Park for us. It's adjacent to our forest, but nowhere near this area. So we talk about that. We talk about, it also includes prime farmlands, wetlands, scenic rivers, wilderness, or ecologically critical areas. And those are those are standard considerations when we're looking at these areas. And then number 7 here is really looking at those cumulative effects that we're looking at for these projects, which I think, again, is, just to show that we're really considering those things in the FONSI. Next slide. So for the decision notice, this is just the different parts of the decision notice. And that comes out, the decision maker is going to basically lay this out. And the deciding official always is going to review the specialist reports, hopefully has participated in the team meetings. Often we'll meet with the team and talk to the team about, the impacts or anything that the team has found to resources out there. So they're engaged throughout the entire process. So there's not like, you know, they have a very good understanding of the project and potential impacts as they move forward. So these are the different parts of that decision they're going to come out with. Next slide. And then again, I just want to put in the public involvement timeline to be super clear on when people can participate. So initial scoping, the draft environmental assessment is going to come out, comment period, objection process is when the final EA comes out, draft decision notice comes out. Works with that next level if that, you know, is something that folks are not comfortable with. And that's a process that you can read there as far as the timing and all that. So that's and there are really rarely any time extensions. So those things pretty much have to happen. You know, you have to get your comments in when they're due and make sure that you're participating all through the process. And for objections, in order to have what's called standing for an objection, you have to participate in the process. You can't just come in, you know, oh, I saw this draft decision and I don't like it. You know, that just won't work. Basically, if you participated and you just feel like, you know, hey, I sent this information in and the forest did not pay attention to it. They didn't listen to what I was saying. They didn't look at the information, the research that I provided, you know, then you definitely have standing for objection. Next slide. So that's an EA, environmental assessment. Again, we have to defend those FONSI, finding a no significant impact. Has to be, you know, has to be able to say, hey, we just don't have any impacts, and here's what it looked like, and we don't. If you can't do that, if there is going to be a significant impact, have to do an EIS. So that's the first reason why you do an EIS. And historically, the process, or it has worked where, like, you know, you might start with an EA, and then you realize, hey, this project potentially could have, or we think it is going to have a significant impact. We need to switch to an EIS. So that has been a way that things have evolved into EISs also. But I think today, most of the time, the forests will choose to do an EA or an EIS with pretty good knowledge of what they need to do, what the potential impacts are out there. And it doesn't typically change from an EA to EIS because the processes are different. The analysis is the same, but the procedures are quite different. How you have to, you know, notice and some of the other things with the EIS, which we'll talk about. So, and, you know, number one reason really is that we have gaps in knowledge. We just don't know what's happening in some of these areas or have that information. And then the other couple categories there, you can see that are required by law. So that's the class 1, class 2 in different cases. So I don't think I need to, or I should say policy, not law. That's policy. Next slide. So this is just, again, showing some of the differences, typically much more upfront collaboration, including field trips and open houses. The notice of intent, that all has to be published in the Federal Register. So it's much more process oriented. The comment periods are longer. Many more, it's just the time frame is really much broader for these projects. But again, the analysis process is very similar or exact. It's not like that's any different. It's just it's the process and procedural pieces. And that's, again, required by regulations. Next slide. So this is the additional section. So the document itself it's going to be much larger. The document that I use as an example here is over 700 pages. So it's just much more detail because, again, the project is much more complicated and much more complex. And so you can see there's just, in addition to all those the sections we talked about, there's a lot more information in each one of these, in each EIS. And, you know, that's all I'll say there. Next slide. This is just an example. Again, I pulled an old EIS, decision already made. It's just the cover photo. Next slide. So the EA that we looked at was 9 pages total. The table of contents for this is 10 pages. So again, just showing the much different, the complexity and the detail that's going to be put in these EISs. It's huge. It's very different. It's just much more information because of the complexity of the project. And, you know, there's 3 pages just showing the maps and the figures and the tables. in this table of contents. Next slide. So for chapter 1, it's again, purpose and need for this is a 20-page, it's 20 pages. So it's very detailed. It's going to talk about why are we doing this, why here, why now for that purpose and need. And this is specifically from that document. And I will say that those are the 5 bullets down below. Those aren't in any particular order. It's just these are the primary purposes and needs of the project. And again, in the EIS, there's, several paragraphs that describe each one of those items. So very detailed information in here to be as clear as possible to our publics why we're doing this. Next slide. Alternatives, again, we did scoping with our proposed action, got information back from our publics, and developed a couple of alternatives because of the significant issues that were generated by our publics. And for this project, this is a salvage logging after large fire. You can see the large amount of acres that are being proposed. So there was lots of comments, lots of information came back, and significant issues included snag forest retention, habitat, new road construction, wildlife habitat, salvage logging, and soil and watershed impacts. So lots of different significant issues that help generate some very specific additional alternatives to the project. And on this slide, it's unusual, I would say, but you see the 2 columns on that, or the 3 columns on the graphic. The proposed action for scoping was slightly different than the alternative 1 proposed action because of just the amount of information we had between going out with that proposed action and scoping and what we knew by the time the EIS was coming out. And so we tried to tighten those acres. We just had better GIS data and better on the ground data. Typically the proposed action doesn't change, but here we felt, it made sense to change it because we had that information and really wanted to be as accurate as possible. So, and then in the EISs, they're also going to talk about probably alternatives that were considered, but not fully developed, but eliminated from detailed study. So you can see, because a lot of times people will suggest, hey, how about this alternative? And so it'll be in this document talking about this is the alternative, but this is why we're not going to fully develop it. And it's because it doesn't really meet the purpose and need. Next slide. So this is probably the big difference between the EIS and EA. EAs don't generally tend to have affected environment in them. And that's what this is talking about. This is an example again from Spotted Owls from this EIS. It's in chapter 3, it's with the environmental consequences. And it's going to basically talk about the habitat and information for each species. So it's very detailed. In this EIS, the environmental effects and the affected environment for wildlife is 120 pages. So there's a ton of information and it's very species specific. So for just terrestrial wildlife, you're going to have, spotted owl, it's going to talk about the affected environment and then the environmental consequences. You're going to have goshawk, you're going to have affected environment, environmental consequences, because those can be very different. The affected environment can really vary by resource and by species for that matter. And so that is unique to each situation and each resource. So it could change, well, it will change for each resource person that's doing analysis and for each species. Next slide. And then environmental consequences, again, it's going to be broken out probably a little cleaner than it is in the EA. It's going to have direct and indirect effects. Those can be separated. Oftentimes they'll be combined like this, and then cumulative effects. And again, this is straight from that EIS. And the analysis is, like I say, it's the same as for an EA, but it's just usually displayed a little differently, a little more detail. It's site-specific analysis. And again, each resource person does it independently. They're doing their own thing. They're not being told what they're going to find, where they're going to do it, any of that. They're doing the analysis for the project and the project area. Next slide. This is a section that I think I really encourage people to look at. It's usually the last chapter in the appendice for most EISs. And it's a response to public comments. And again, this is a specific example from the EIS. I think it has just an extremely informative, it's an extremely informative section, ton of information, and helps people understand the level of detail that the Forest Service is looking at when they do their analysis. It's, we don't just get information from folks from the outside and say, oh yeah, no, we don't think so. This is the level of detail that we get into for any sort of information that we're provided, especially research, that, to let folks know, hey, we did consider it, we did look at it, this is why we didn't utilize that information or didn't feel like it was, as the best information we could use compared to this study that we used. And so response to comments, I think, is extremely informative and really helps. I think it helps the public and it helped me understand just how much analysis or how much time people spent to get into the details of projects. Next slide. And this is just a couple slides on the record of decision. So for the EA, we have the decision notice and FONSI, right? And for EISs, we're going to have a record of decision. And again, this is 61 pages, I think. It's much more detailed. It's going to really break down why that decision was made. You can see the different, aspects of the different parts of it. Next slide. And that's the second half, I guess I'll say, of that. Questions? Woo.
I'm going to look at the chat. Maybe we could, what I'm going to do in the time we have left is let's try to ask questions. If folks have thoughts about any of this, they want to express opinions, I encourage you to let us know you're interested in this topic, and then we will invite you to one of our meetings or to all of our meetings. And we have long discussions about these issues. So I'd like to try to confine this to the topic of these NEPA processes. And questions to Maria on that. Okay, so I'm going through the list. Okay, I see some questions. Oh, a whole bunch of questions here. Okay, so the first set of questions: USFS does not appear to include our current climate crisis and its many impacts in their NEPA and EIS analysis and risk assessments to environment, such as in determining whether timber clear cuts are appropriate and allowable, especially as a combined analysis and not just each timber sale specific to a site. Is that correct? And could you address this? And if this is true, how can it be said to be meeting its mission and following its own requirements for determining real environmental impact? Marie, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll say historically we didn't. Absolutely not. Yeah, we just didn't really look at it too much. I mean, we might have had a couple paragraphs in it and said, okay, that's good. But I can tell you today that's very much changing. National policy is to include information on climate change and really look at that. So I've been retired almost 3 years now, and it's rapidly changed since I retired. But I know that it is being included. I've talked to folks who are still working for the agency, and they say, yeah, it's much more emphasized today. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's doing what it needs to do, but I will say that it's changed significantly from when I was working for the agency, where we really, we talked about it, there's a couple, it's in there, but we really didn't do it justice. So that's changing, which is a good thing.
Let me add that this is something that you can, if you feel there's a local project that doesn't take climate into consideration enough, it's in its documentation, then that's your time to speak up. I'll mention another thing that the Forest Service is in the middle of rulemaking to protect old growth and mature forests, and they are definitely acknowledging the importance of forests in sequestering carbon and for fighting climate change, and trying to figure out new rules that would apply to all forest projects in all states. There's been comment periods on that, and there are going to be additional comment periods as they formulate this policy and rulemaking over this next year. Okay, here's a question: does USFS ever choose the no action when it comes to timber leases in industry? Who is deciding how much is too much?
Well, I would say I don't know of that ever happening. I'll put it that way. It's highly unlikely because if a proposal goes out, there's obviously a need or desire to do it. And so it's pretty unusual to choose the no action. I would hope that if, usually I think what would happen is the project, they wouldn't actually choose that. They would just like stop or, not complete the project. But I've never seen a no action chosen as far as, hey, we're not going to do that. Because again, they propose this action because they think there's a need or there's a desire or whatever reason we have for doing that.
And this person asked one more question about categorical exclusions. All right, do you know of specific type? Can you say generally what kind of projects get categorical exclusions?
There are very specific lists. So if you just Google that, what I did for a lot of this is, and they'll list those very specific categories for you. So you'll see them in there. Like I say, it's everything from mowing the lawn, which, it's an action. So we should be doing NEPA on, to there's some, I think, smaller acreage timber sales or salvage sales that can be done over there. So, but the list, the categories are very specific and they're very pretty detailed in what they are. So yeah, you can definitely just Google that and those things will come up. Okay, say Secretary of Ag, and it's the Chief of the Forest Service.
Okay. Somebody brought up about wood pellet projects, mentioning 2 wood pellet projects are proposed in California, one in Lassen and one in Tuolumne. The industry claims it will only use salvage wood and unmerchantable trees, but they have significant production goals, and they made the same claims in the Southeast, but have been taking whole big trees, often from mature hardwood forests. How can the Forest Service guarantee that only waste would be used? But more important, I live in San Joaquin County, near the port of Stockton. The constant increase of harm to our air quality with thousands of trucks, trains, and ships added to our community are a serious concern to our disadvantaged communities. Does the Forest Service look at these effects on communities, and possibly mandate significant mitigations before approving projects? So it's kind of focusing on wood pellet.
I'm not an expert in that, but I'll tell you, again, we don't approve wood pellet plants. That's the county or somebody else. What we are doing is projects on Forest Service land. So what we would be doing is NEPA for any sort of, material, whatever that would be, that would go to wood pellets, and so that is what we have to analyze for. And what it's going to come down to, I think, for some of that would be, the Forest Service sells timber sales, right? And those are going to go to the highest bidder. And, I don't think a pellet organization is going to make as much as a lumber organization. But again, the analysis for us is going to be, hey, we're selling this. And that's when, we would be analyzing that activity, but not the utilization or how the pellet plant is operating. That's not our thing.
Okay. All right. So.
And let me add one thing to that too, to be clear. It's like, so we're not guaranteeing, Forest Service is not guaranteeing this pellet company material. It's not happening because we can't. So, because I think some people might think, oh, well, they're coming there because they're guaranteed X amount. We're not. We can't. We have to do that analysis for that material to be removed. So there's, they might feel like they've got a guarantee, but there is no guarantee because that all has to go through that process.
So here's a question. Has there been any modern assessment using truly current data on the effects on wildlife and human health regarding levels of uses of glyphosate and other toxic pesticides allowed on U.S. Forest Service land? Are you familiar with that, Maria?
Yeah. So glyphosate. So anytime the Forest Service has a project, which if you saw the category exclusions, that's one reason, that's one area that we can't use category or can't use a category exclusion on, or even in EA. I think we do EISs for all those now. So anytime the Forest Service does any sort of chemical proposal for herbicides or pesticides, they do basically a human health and risk assessment for all those chemicals. So that's very, again, site specific. What's being proposed, what's the percentage, how much is going to be sprayed, all that information is done on that for every individual project that we do.
I guess my question was more about how really modern is the science they're using for decision-making on glyphosate, because there's a lot of new information out there about its effects on health, especially human health. Is that being taken into consideration now?
Yeah, the Forest Service is, for the agency, it's really critical to use the latest and best science for any project we do. Now, I'm sure we could have a really good discussion on what's the latest and best science, certainly the best science. So that's where it gets a little tricky. But they are using the latest information that's out there, yes. Or they should be, I'll put it that way. And I know when I worked there, we did. And I'm especially for something that's as controversial as this, I'm pretty sure they are, because we know it's almost a guarantee we're probably going to get litigated for any sort of large scale project that's using any herbicide. And so, if we're going to go to court, we better be using the latest science or we're going to lose. And should, frankly.
So here's a question. I don't know if this one, there's a broad question. I don't know if there's much we can say about this one. It's more of a it's more of a broad question but it's how much impact does or could the current political situation have on changing the process of the impact statements? And I think you talked about the politics a little bit, but if you want to add anything else on that, Maria, or you can pass on this one.
I would just say it has to be passed. It has to be the law. I don't think there's an executive order that can be done to change this. This is law. I like to think that, but certainly Congress can pass whatever laws Congress wants to pass. So, I think we all probably agree with how the potential impacts could be for that.
Somebody had a question about, can you describe what is currently being proposed for forest sequestration? I believe that might be the current rulemaking that I mentioned. Is that, I think maybe that's what's being referred to here in the question. I don't know who asked this question, but you wanted to speak up and clarify what you meant by that.
I was wondering if you were, I was wondering, hi, this is Sheila. I was wondering if you were getting at carbon capture and sequestration or just natural processes.
What do you mean that, Sheila? What do you mean by natural processes? What do you think?
Just regular transpiration trees. Taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, or are you, when you talk about forest sequestration, are you talking about something else? You brought it up, I thought.
Yeah. Well, what I brought up was interest at the U.S. Forest Service at the national level and coming up with rules for protecting old growth and mature trees, and recognizing their tremendous value in sequestering carbon. As to how that's measured, there are a lot of scientists who are professionals at collecting data on how much sequestration of carbon is occurring at different points relative to size, relative to species, relative to age, and they have complex data instrumentation on all the different components of carbon, the carbon cycle as it impacts trees and as trees impact the carbon. So, in and out of the tree. So, in relative to age and species and all that. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, I was wondering if you were getting to that or if you were more concerned about the proposed carbon capture and sequestration, with concern about it being placed in forests or not. So that's what I was getting at.
Okay, Maria, do you have anything to add on that?
No. Again,
mean,
you know,
yeah, go ahead.
our focus today was really just to have an understanding of the NEPA the NEPA documents and how to really look at them, yourself and critically understand kind of what's being proposed, why it's being proposed, and then looking at the impacts that are identified in that document. And, if you think there's going to be additional ones, then participating for sure. But that's really the goal today. It wasn't about any specific project or any specific thing that's happening today.
Sure. Thank you.
And I could say that, how you, the value of forests and trees and carbon sequestration and the wood pellet industry are topics that we like to talk about in our team meetings. So you're welcome to join and participate and have input on those conversations on these topics. Here's a question for you, Maria. Has the USFS seen an increase in recent years of lawsuits relative to using or not using climate science in their analyses?
I don't know. Like I say, I've been retired for almost 3 years. I know we never did, but that was, 3 years plus ago. But it might today. I don't know. Climate change is hard because a lot of it's about scale. And so for the Forest Service historically, I'm not sure, like say what we're doing today, but historically, when you're only looking at, a 5,000 acre project and there's, millions and, there's 1 million acres on the Stanislaus and there's, how many millions of acres of forest land. That's kind of how they looked at it. Now, again, cumulative effects with all the projects, but even with all the projects, we're not talking about, couple hundred, it's not even 100,000 acres probably a year annually. And so that's how it was approached historically. I think today we're, not doing it that way, but that becomes kind of the issue, was that dilution because of the smallness of the projects that were being done.
If I can just clarify, that question I had really was inherent in a different question I asked. And that seems like a really important question, the part about whether it's a cumulative effect that the Forest Service is making on, say, tree cutting on all of their lands and what effect that has on climate versus treating each specific plot. I mean, that would be, that would not make any sense. So is it meeting its mission when it comes to, and is it absolutely using a cumulative analysis, or is it not?
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that, but I would say, keep in mind, even with all of the work that's being done across the nation annually, it's a very, very, very small percentage of land that's being impacted. It may not feel like it sometimes, but it really is. I mean, it's just, we just don't have the capability to do that much work on that much land annually for a multitude of reasons.
Let me just say something about that also, that there are some lawsuits out there on some forest projects. I've seen one, for example, where a judge starts factoring in the climate issues around carbon sequestration and carbon emissions. And there is broadly the issue around to what extent does a local project matter in the scheme of worldwide carbon emissions and worldwide global warming. And this is something that's coming up in a lot of different public policy debates and lawsuits, not just around forests, but around pollution of, oil industry, wood, whatever, wood pellets, the whole climate cycle and the whole role of carbon and the local versus the global. Definitely a big deal now, and will continue to be. So I think we're going to wrap it up right now because we're running out of time. Let's just have one quick question. This is a good maybe you can answer this quickly. How many millions of acres does the USFS manage nationally? Maria, do you know the answer?
I just Googled it. So it's 193 million acres. And the federal government has 238.4 million acres. It's a lot of acres.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for that. And the website, somebody wants to know the website to join the climate interest group. Diz, can you participate? Can you give like a link or something like that? Or how do we want to tell these folks how to quickly sign up.
How to quickly sign up. I will put in the chat the join link.
That'd be great. If you could do that right now and before I wrap things up, that would be excellent. Again, you know, these are all right. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your participation and your excellent questions, and Maria for your excellent description of the process. You know, I think that again, you know, if people have very strong opinions on this topic, it's very controversial and complicated, and I encourage you to come to our meetings, express your thoughts. If you have articles you want to present or you know, or whatever in the process of expressing your thoughts, and please do it. We really want to view this as the beginning of your involvement in these issues, not the end of it. Okay, great. So thank you so much. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, team. And thank you, participants. And hope to speak to you soon. Okay.
Thank you.
All
And
right.
before we go, the last two things in the chat are a join link and a link to the Climate Interest Group webpage. So you might want to click on those while you can.
And when you go to the climate interest group, you want to mention that you're interested in the forest and wildfires topic, right? And then that would be a flag for me to get a notification you're interested in our team, and we'll send you a Zoom link invitation to a meeting. Okay. All right. Thank you. I think Diz is the leader here, so she'll sign us off here.